Let's see here where we're at. All right. We are good to go, I believe. Gonna double check here on the gram. Perfect. It looks like everybody is on. Great. Okay. Hi, and welcome to another little live that we're going to do today. I'm really excited about today's episode because I was just at bar class. So I do bar 3 here in Edmonds. And it just came to me that I should talk about really keeping your pelvic floor healthy throughout your entire life and really what it looks like to have a healthy pelvic floor and why you need to care about this. So I'm going to get started and talk a little bit about that today. If you have questions, I sometimes don't see them until the end of the episode, but I will usually answer them in the next day or two. And I got a really good question a couple days ago. It was if I treat my incontinence or if I treat my prolapse, can it come back? So someone asked that. And I'm super excited to kind of dive into that today. And we'll answer that question and really talk about that just leads into so beautifully of like how to keep your pelvic floor healthy throughout your life. Okay. All right, I'm gonna take a sip of my coffee. It's 11:18. I haven't had a coffee yet today. Um, Although it is decaf, it's still lovely. If you don't know, I'm Dr. Allison Felt, owner of Body Motion Physical Therapy, located in downtown Edmonds, Washington. So, and we are a specialty pelvic health clinic where we really focus on infertility, fertility, pregnancy, preparing for birth, helping decrease the C-section rate in America, and also put the postpartum period, really, and beyond. So everything across the lifespan when it comes to your pelvic floor. Except for pediatrics, we do refer out for pediatrics. So I just found it, I think it is really important that we talk about what does a healthy pelvic floor look like? How do you keep your pelvic floor healthy throughout a lifespan? So like every day, I'm going to dive into the anatomy. I'm going to tell you what a healthy pelvic floor should be doing. And then I'm going to tell you about why a lot of people don't have healthy pelvic floors or when dysfunction starts, like how the body compensates. So let's talk about all of this. It's a huge topic. So first, let's get a baseline together of what a pelvic floor is, okay? So here's pelvis, here is pelvic floor. Pelvic floor has 3 holes, anus, vagina, and urethra. So pooping, peeing, birth, and sex, okay? And so pelvic floor is responsible for all of those functions, okay? And helps regulate the functions and keep things normal, okay? The pelvic floor is 3 layers of muscles, fascia, nerves, blood vessels. And the first layer is this layer here that I just threw off. The second layer is not pictured. It's more of a fascial layer with some blood vessels and nerves. The third layer is this deep, it's called levator ani, but it's a combination of multiple muscles. And so that's the third layer, okay? And then we have hip muscles that are also inside the pelvic floor. So you see that? These are actually hip muscles. So that's why so many people with hip pain that doesn't resolve with standard physical therapy can really have issues within some of these internal hip muscles inside the pelvis. So just something good to know. All right. So let's talk about keeping this healthy. What does it look like to keep things healthy? Well, we can talk about it from just like a symptom. No, let's talk about it from what the muscles should be doing. Okay, so what should a healthy pelvic floor be able to do? Well, a healthy pelvic floor should be able to relax and contract. Should also be able to relax and then bulge open. Okay, so contract, relax, and bulge. We need the bulge for pooping and farting and birthing a baby. We need the contraction to hold things up. All right. So let's say you're going to go on a run and you're going to like run around town or you're training for a marathon or a half marathon and you leak when you run. Well, some people might go on a run and say like, I need to contract my pelvic floor the entire run. Okay. Or some people maybe have been taught that, but that is absolutely not the case. So a healthy pelvic floor with running, jumping, jump roping, um, I don't know, any ballistic activity or even just walking, a healthy pelvic floor is going to have a nice recoil. So every time your foot hits the ground, there's just going to be this like slinky mechanism of the core of your pelvic floor, the bottom of your core. Okay. And that's what should be happening. And so it's really exciting because you don't have to just be Kegling the whole time. You want your pelvic floor to have this dynamic effect. And so for it to have that dynamic effect, it has to be able to contract, relax, and bulge. Okay. So when we get that dynamic effect, then we don't deal with things like incontinence. We typically don't have pooping problems. We typically have healthier joints because we have this little shock absorber working inside of our body. So that's the good news. And that's what we want to keep the pelvic floor doing. Okay. So that would be like a healthy, happy pelvic floor can do those things. Now, most pelvic floors that we come in contact with, but not just because we're a pelvic expert physical therapy clinic. Really, what we see, and I see this across the board, is that most people walk around with a really tight pelvic floor, or they're like kind of always in a Kegel. This can be for a few reasons. This can be because of stress. This can be because they work out really hard and their muscles are just really taut and tight, but then their muscles don't know how to relax. Okay. Or they can have a really flexible joints, super flexible. Like they're the people in yoga class that can go all the way into the poses and lock out their joints. And then, so typically that means that their pelvic floor is going to be gripping and trying to hold their pelvis together. They are, then you also have people that have really weak butts. So if you have a weak butt, so your glutes are weak, your pelvic floor is going to grip and tighten to try and hold together your pelvis and take the load off of the glutes. So it's going to be doing the heavy lifting for the glutes. Well, if you know what glute muscles look like at all, I could stand up and show you my butt, but that would just be funny. If you know what glute muscles look like at all, right? It's your buttocks, okay? So a healthy buttock is going to be your glute muscles. So those we want to have nice glute muscles in order to help support the pelvis, support the hip joint, and also take the pressure off this pelvic floor so the pelvic floor can have that really nice dynamic movement and effect. Okay. So follow me with that. Okay. Um, Hopefully that makes sense. So, how do we keep our pelvic floor healthy? Um, it's many things. All right. So, hormones are also going to change, can also have an effect on the contractility of the pelvic floor, the quality of the pelvic floor. Typically, I like to describe it as this. If you don't know how to use your pelvic floor, or you're kind of stuck in that Kegel mentality, you're stuck in always using like being in a Kegel, or you've just been taught to contract your pelvic floor, you don't really know how to feel it relax, but you can feel it contract, like kind of, and you feel it like you're doing something, but you just you it doesn't feel like it's a ton of movement. If you're stuck in that position, or you have a lot of stress in your life, or you start going through premenopause and some hormonal changes where your estrogen starts to decrease. This ends up creating an unhealthy pelvic floor. So, what does an unhealthy pelvic floor look like? Well, it looks like a muscle that has difficulty relaxing and bulging. Okay. So, it doesn't have that natural dynamic recoil slinky effect that we're looking for every time our foot hits the ground. So, then we have a weaker core because the pelvic floor is part of the core and it's not doing its job. So, then our joints start to do more of the work and the heavy lifting, and our pelvic floor just tightens to try and support it more. But that tightening can cause more issues like pelvic organ prolapse, or can even exacerbate a hernia, or can exacerbate a diastasis recti, which is a split of the abdominal wall. And so it's really important that we learn how to keep that pelvic floor healthy and open and have that mobility throughout the entire lifespan. So, um, what it typically feels like on evaluation. So if we're going to evaluate these muscles, a pelvic expert physical therapist would feel what these muscles are doing. So what we typically say they feel like, they end up feeling more like beef jerky. So they end up feeling like a dehydrated muscle, a stringy muscle, not a healthy plump vascular, that's not a good word, healthy plump muscle that's sometimes you can compare it to like a steak, right? Like that's like you would eat a steak and it's a chunky muscle, okay? But versus beef jerky is like dried out. And so in order to have this healthy pelvic floor, we want to keep that steak, we want to keep that juiciness, we want to keep that muscle super, super hydrated and feeling good so it can move through this whole range of motion. Okay. It's like every single muscle in your body, it's just inside your pelvic floor. So it's a little harder to access and is a little bit more mysterious because no one ever teaches us how to really properly work this muscle. So those are just some important things to know. So let's go back to, so what would it look like to keep this muscle healthy? So it looks like that you can go through the full range of motion, that this muscle feels soft. It means that you wouldn't have any difficulty leaking urine, any difficulty with urgency. So if the shower was running, you wouldn't leak, or if you got home and you had to put your key in the door, you wouldn't have any issues with urgency or incontinence. So stress incontinence, urge incontinence. You wouldn't have any issues with like queefing or issues with what are some other things with indicative of prolapse? You wouldn't have any issues with heaviness. You wouldn't have any, so pelvic heaviness. You wouldn't have any constipation issues. So keeping all of this healthy, it's like all of your systems healthy, right? So, and you wouldn't have any issues with intercourse. So keeping the pelvic floor healthy is going to keep all of those systems functioning and happy for you. Okay. So it's really important and can change the quality of your life, because if you feel great and you don't have, you're not peeing your pants, you're not living with back pain. So back and hip pain and neck pain can all be part of having this dysfunctional pelvic floor, especially back and hip pain and knee pain too. So it's really all related and connected. You look at the pelvis and it's the center of our body, right? So that part of the core is controlling all of your joints. It's controlling all the forces that come through your body. And so it's super extremely important. Um, so why is this relevant and why did I think about this today when I was in bar class? Okay. It's because I just think about everyone working really hard and if people go to bar or go to their exercise class every single day or a few times a week, and whatever our exercise is of choice, it's important, right? It's important that we exercise every day. We need to move our bodies. Our bodies are meant to move, and if we don't move them, then they become dehydrated and beef turkey like, right? Or beef jerky like, beef jerky. And so we want to keep our bodies moving and healthy and happy. So we have all of those mobility and have the blood flow and keep our heart healthy. I don't need to tell you about that, right? It's the same for the pelvic floor. So does going to exercise class keep your keep your pelvis healthy? It absolutely can. But what we end up seeing is, people that might not be stabilizing the movement well, or maybe you're working really hard in a posture and your glutes aren't turning on, and your pelvic floor is having to do all of the work to stabilize you. Well, what's going to end up happening is your pelvic floor is going to tighten really tight in order to stabilize you. Now you want to make sure that that pelvic floor lets go. So regardless of what your activity of choice is, so whether that's CrossFit, whether that's bar, whether that's Orange Theory, whether that's just lifting weights, whether that's training for a marathon, whatever it is, typically you need your pelvic floor to stay in this dynamic state. And the very first thing to go when you have an injury or when you tweak something, or when your form's not accurate or 100% on point, or your postures in certain moves are not stabilized by your core muscles, what's the first thing to go? It's your pelvic floor. All right. Your first thing to not be firing appropriately is your pelvic floor, because the pelvic floor is just automatic response is going to tighten to try and stabilize the movement. When it tightens all the time and it's not supported by the rest of the core, including the glutes, that's going to create issues and create dysfunctions. So what does this look like? So let's say that you're lifting heavy weights and you are doing some weights that might be beyond your capacity or are like your one repetition max. Okay. You're really excited to do these weights. And let's say that let's just do deadlifts for example. Deadlifts are an amazing movement. Everybody should know how to deadlift because that is how we need to use our hips in order to protect our spine. And so if you don't know how to deadlift, you absolutely should learn how, because just that alone and activating your glutes like that can help protect your pelvic floor. However, let's say that you don't know how to deadlift appropriately, or you're holding your breath when you shouldn't be, or the weight is just really heavy and your pelvic floor is just working overtime to try and squeeze to pull you up from that deadlift position. Well, if you are in a deadlift position and then you go into the standing position, so you go through the range of motion, so it's a hip hinge, okay? And you don't exhale as you come up. This is going to be different for different people, but let's say you don't exhale and you're squeezing your pelvic floor. Maybe you bear down through a squeezed pelvic floor. Well, that can cause pressure down on your bladder that can make the pressure inside the vagina more, and that can cause your bladder to start descending. So that can increase your risk of a pelvic organ prolapse. So, what does this mean? This means that we need our pelvic floors to be that dynamic, healthy mover. So, when you do go to deadlift a super heavy weight, your pelvic floor knows how to respond and then knows how to relax. Okay. It's a little bit more tricky because it has to go with your breath as well. So, one thing I'll teach you is that when you inhale, so if you take a deep breath into your belly and then maybe your chest, what should be happening is your pelvic floor should actually be opening and like descending. So that's that descend movement. That's really hard for some people to get. And then as you exhale, you get naturally a recoil. So the pelvic floor naturally contracts a little bit and comes back up. So if you're not getting that movement and you get stuck into that contracted state, that's going to cause a lot of issues just along throughout the lifespan. So back to going to your exercise routine or going, doing what I don't know, whatever movement that is for you that you enjoy. The way to keep your pelvic floor in this dynamic state is to get an evaluation by a pelvic expert PT so you know exactly how to use your pelvic floor. What we see here at our clinic, and this is just anecdotal, like exact clinical, what we're seeing clinically, not necessarily indicative in the research, but we have a program where we just see people once a month. So we check their pelvic floors throughout their life. And if they're just maintaining, they might not come as frequently. But if they're training for something or trying new exercises, they might have to come a little bit more to keep their pelvic floor mobile and to keep their pelvic floor responding and keep their core functioning so they can do these activities without having more issues down the line. So when I sat in bar class today and we're doing breathing to release our bodies after we worked hard for an hour, my thought is like, oh, I just wish every single person here could come do pelvic floor therapy so they could learn to like bring this breath all the way down into their pelvic floor, because that would make it that much more beneficial for them. And they would maybe, like it just made me think like how many people are actually doing this so it's helpful for their body. The exercise is great. It's amazing if you know what you're doing and if you can stabilize the movement. But it's like how many people pelvic floors are just squeezing tight, just in doing all the work because their glutes aren't doing the work. Um, and so I think personally, every single person should go see a pelvic expert PT because it's your lifeline. Like keeping the pelvis healthy is going to prevent you from peeing your pants. It can prevent you from a hip replacement. It can prevent you from a labral a labral repair. It can, because a lot of people have labral tears and they're told to get a hip surgery. But if they just treat the pelvic floor, that can cure their hip issue. And so there's just so much that can help and really create that like lifelong healthy pelvic floor. And so does it take maintenance? Yeah, because there's going to be times where your hormones shift and things are going to get tighter and maybe a little bit more dehydrated and not as mobile. And so do they need help? Yeah, but that's when you just check back in with your pelvic expert PT and you get that situated. And it's very much like you take your car to the shop every year, right? Or every 6 months, or you get your oil changed. You do this, you need to do the same thing for your pelvic floor. There's nothing different about this. It's like this is like the most essential part of your body, right? It's like the basis of your core. It's going to keep your whole entire body healthy. And so you simply just need to take your body to the shop, right? And get it tuned up and make sure that the muscles and your posture is exactly, supportive for all the exercises that you want to be doing and the life you want to be living. But typically in America, at least in America, that's where we are. We don't really believe in prevention. Most people, you know, I wouldn't say most people. We live in an area where people do really care about their health, and that is awesome. But a lot of people, just don't have the option or knowledge to know like this is such an essential part of your health. And just by learning how to utilize your pelvic floor, and it like goes to your whole body. So if you've been dealing with knee pain for like years, it- go see a pelvic expert PT. Go, same thing with the hip. Like if you have chronic hip pain, like go see a pelvic expert PT. Find out like, is this stuff coming from my pelvis, and what's happening here, and what's going on with my posture? Like what needs to change so I can be healthy and have a healthy pelvic floor. So I hope that's helpful and gives you some guidance on really like everyone needs to see a pelvic expert PT. Really, there's not someone who shouldn't, because we need to know how these muscles work. Like this is your lifeline. This is gonna, keep you healthy the rest of your life. So you don't have to be in diapers, peeing your pants as you get older, dealing with the hip replacements, dealing with the knee replacements. There's so much that can be done. And especially like doing it before menopause can have long lasting effects. And so that's my stance on that. I think it would be good right now for me to go back to the question that I got a few days ago. And so that question was, if I treat my incontinence now and or if I treat my prolapse now, can it come back? So the answer for that is, once you have a pelvic organ prolapse, sometimes it will reduce. So sometimes it will go back to where it's coming from. And that's what we wanted to happen. So if you're postpartum, maybe by 18 months, you might get it to go back to its places. Or if you learn how to take the stress off your prolapse, you can get it to go back to its place and kind of stay there and just manage it. Or it might not go back, but you can at least manage all the symptoms. And so you can be completely continent, you can be completely pain free, you can be completely, heaviness free, and you can have no incontinence and have no constipation or pressure issues when you're pooping. Okay, so you can get your pelvic floor to a place where your organs, are asymptomatic. So you don't even really know you have a prolapse. I guarantee you, most women are walking around with a prolapse and they just don't know they're walking around with a prolapse, and that's because they're not symptomatic. But it's like that's another reason, get pelvic floor PT so you don't become symptomatic. You have to learn how to use your pelvic floor and your pressure system to prevent those symptoms from happening. So to keep your organs in place. Okay. So, so once you fix this, can it come back? Yes, it totally can. So even once you fix the incontinence and it's not from a pelvic organ prolapse, it can still come back. And it's just really important to know that, because um, it's just something you need to manage through the rest of your life. So if you learned how to use your pelvic floor, you got your pelvic, maybe you were able, like you worked really hard for a month or 2 or 6 to like get your pelvic floor to that lengthened position. And you were able to do this contracting and relaxing and bulging. So every step you took, you were getting that great movement. Maybe you got yourself to that position, but um but then you started to notice some of the incontinence is coming back. Well, that would be a time, like, check back in with your pelvic PT and really figure out, like, okay, maybe I just need a tune up. Maybe these muscles simply just need a tune up. All right. And that's normal. That's like taking your car to the shop. Like, keep it healthy, keep it in check. You know how to use it now. And once you have all the tools to use it, you can do a really good job at keeping it healthy, but you will need probably need tune-ups, especially as your hormones change as we age. Or if you're breastfeeding, a lot of times that like initial breastfeeding, the first 6 months, you're going to have some changes hormonally. And then even up until 18 months, if you're still breastfeeding, you'll have even more hormonal changes. And then after you cease breastfeeding, an additional 18 months, and you'll have, you're kind of be back to your baseline hormones. Those all those hormonal shifts are going to change the pelvic floor integrity and pelvic floor quality. And so that could change whether you experience heaviness, pelvic organ prolapse, or incontinence. And so throughout these hormonal changes, it is really good to just check in, tune up your pelvic floor, make sure you're still working it and you're able to get that full relaxation, full bulge, and then full contraction. And, like same thing with the running, right? So if you go back to running or whatever exercise that you do, you just want to make sure that you have this dynamic, slinky quality to the way that your pelvic floor bounces. I guess it's looking like bouncing right now. So you want to have that mentality or that quality to the pelvic floor, because that's going to be your shock absorber. That's what's going to keep your core strong. That's what's going to keep your organs in place. And so that's just important to know. So I hope that was helpful in answering how to keep your pelvic floor healthy through a lifespan. And so you know the range of motion you need for your pelvic floor to be healthy. You know that it needs to be hydrated and not feel like beef jerky. And then you know that most likely you'll need tune-ups. Everyone needs to see a pelvic expert PT. And, it's 100% true. Like, we need to keep our pelvic floors and our entire cores working through our lifespan, right? So if we spend a month on the couch, our pelvic floor is going to be weak, and our pelvic floor and core is not going to be working for us. And so it's like, okay, we got to tune that back up. We got to get that back to working for us so we can do our exercises and all of our activities that we want. So we're not hurting ourselves. So hopefully that was helpful. If you guys have questions, of course, just shoot me an email or drop a line in the question box. All right. Take care.